Good evening. Welcome back to News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. Thank you so much for joining with us. Of course, on the theme of Women's Month, we are now shifting the focus to corporate, to the private sector, to economics, to business, and of course, the contribution that our female compatriots in our country have played in really shaping how things are from an economics perspective. Much more can be done, as we are still on our fingers counting the amount of female CEOs or chairpersons that are occupied within the economic sector and in the commerce sector itself. So today we're going to be speaking to two ladies who work for Absa Bank. Let me welcome my first guest. Her name is Khanya Matshikwe, and she's the head of Customer Value Proposition SME at Absa Relationship Banking. Khanya, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Faraz, for having me.
No, absolute pleasure having you on. Khanya, I want to touch on the role that a women have played within the commerce sector. You're telling me off air, you close to 13 years within the financial services. Have we seen a progression of that? Is it enough really to tell that there's a direction which is moving in the right pace and at the right purpose for female representation?
Well, I'd start off by saying, Faraz, that there certainly has been progress, right? But we started off a low base. And so percentage-wise, the numbers would always look very high. A simple example is if you just take a look at the JSE and you count the number of entities on the JSE that are led by women. So I'm talking within the C-suite executive leadership teams, from the CEO right through to the supporting teams. I think there's definitely a lot of room for improvement there. I'm interested to see more businesses led by women, as opposed to, whilst they're important, having women in supportive functions. So if we look at divisions like marketing, like human capital, like strategy, those are certainly important parts of the business. But when we're talking about revenue generating units of the business, that for me is where there's definitely scope for more development, not only in financial services, but across different sectors as well, because it's about representation and pulling up and pulling together different teams.
Khanya, President Cyril Ramaphosa, during his Women's Day speech in the Northern Cape, said that government needs to play a more active role within more female representations, whether it's in big business, whether it's small and medium enterprises. Now, government can talk, and of course the private sector plays its role, but how much of a push does there need to be from government itself to say, listen, legislation and so much more needs to be enacted for there to be more female representation within the commercial sector of our country, especially in economics and business?
I'd say there are two parts to it. The one is, from a legislative perspective, we've got the Employment Equity Code, right? And that's got very specific measures for every single corporate that has a BE scorecard to reach. And it's across different levels, right? Right from junior management right through to senior executive. And I think the mandate is very clear. The objectives are very clear. But there's a very big difference between seeing the legislation written down and actually complying with it, and then actually following heart and mind, right? It's one thing to have a tick box exercise and say we've met the criteria. It's another one for that to be part of the ethos of a company. So for me, that's really where there's more scope for development, because it's not only about what's being pushed from a management perspective and from a legislative point of view, but it's also about what are the supporting mechanisms in place. So that's what I'd say on the corporate side. On the SME side, there are a number of factors. It's about representation in investment teams. So what does it take for a business to scale? One of the things that every single business owner will tell you about is access to financing. What I've seen happen time and again is the representation of women within those investment committees, those credit committees, the decision-making bodies for funding. This is where there definitely needs to be a lot more focus to drive the integration and support for women-led businesses in particular.
Khanya, let's talk on the financial services sector, and I want to touch on, of course, organizations that play a role in it. Mary Vilakazi, she sits as the chairperson of First Rand Bank, which is, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, financial services provider here in the country. We've got Busi Mavuso, who sits, with Business Leadership South Africa, and I mean, she's played quite a huge role in the interaction between government and business. You've got Leila Fourie, who sits in the JSE, and she's the CEO of the JSE. So again, we can count them, but when we speak about the enhancement of that, there has to be that. Now, how much do male compatriots like myself also within that sector allow for that room for expansion, allow for that room of more to occur, because that's important, isn't it?
It certainly is, and it should never be either or, right? So women aren't developing and entering leadership positions at the detriment of men within corporate. And I think that's a very important point to make mention of, because at the end of the day, we have people within executive committees who are allies. Just recently, within Absa as well, we hosted a Women's Day forum. And speaking at the forum was, a member from the men's forum. The importance of that is to say there's a partnership that happens here. So when we're looking at the talent across the business, it's not only women that are assessing other women, right? It's women that are assessing men, men that are assessing women. And that joint conversation is incredibly important. So the fact that we can name these few women in leadership now is testament to the fact that there definitely has been progress. But at the same time, it's testament to the fact that there's room for improvement as well. So those names that you've mentioned, they hold an even bigger responsibility now to say, given the power to put certain measures in place, how is it that trickles down throughout the organization so that it becomes part of the culture as opposed to a tick box exercise to make sure that of this executive committee of 10 members, 5 of them are women. So it's less about counting and more about really strategically positioning both men and women to lead the company in a diverse and inclusive way.
You talk about that Women's Forum that was hosted by Absa. How important are these conversations in a democracy that we have? So, we can always speak about having the conversations, but the fact that it's happening in a democracy, in a beautiful democracy that we have, with the flaws, with the greats that we have within it, that conversation, and talk to us about it and how this enhances more female representation within the financial sector.
It's interesting that you use the word democracy. I'd say that there's no substitute for time.
Yes.
Right? And in as much as when we look back over the last 30 or so years, there are very big strides that have been made. Similarly, there's a whole lot more that can be done from an infrastructure point of view, from a business perspective, from a legislation point of view, and I could go on. So yes, of course, those conversations are important because there's no end date for that, and I'll use this word, transformation. Yes. In itself, it's an ongoing process. And as a result of that, the conversations must continue. And as the change occurs, the conversation and the nuances around it will shift. It will become less about, do we have the appropriate representation, but are we making the right decisions from a product perspective? Are we hearing our customers and our clients? Do we understand the nuances from an age point of view, from how are we including youth, young women in business? And so you can see that it becomes less about the tick box of having a woman representative, but rather, how inclusive is it? And so certainly the conversation must continue to happen. The flavor of it will change over time.
Yeah, definitely. And talking about the flavor of it, just this week, of course, unfortunately, we heard from stats that say 33%, we've breached the 33% unemployment rate, which of course makes it very difficult, and part of that 33% is youth. For somebody, and of course you were at university, you've been through it, you've understood what it is to get to where you are right now in one of the biggest financial institutions in the country. For a young female who's studying and wants to be part within the commerce sector, is there hope? How much of a hope is there for them to enter the sector knowing that they don't have to go through these certain challenges, but they can enter the space with confidence, but also really fulfilling their potential in what is a very contested space?
For us, without hope, we have nothing. So I'd say that there certainly is hope. If I can make a personal reflection, one of the things that has put me in good stead is being very clear about what it is that you want to achieve in your career. There's no substitute for excellence. Right, so in as much as there are programs, development programs for young people in commerce, for women in commerce, for black people in commerce, there's no substitute for excellence. And having the right kind of mentorship and sponsorship within the business is also quite important. So as you show up on a daily basis, doing the things that you need to do, doing even more than the things that you need to do, all of a sudden, your name is mentioned in rooms that you aren't in. And for me, in my career, as I reflect over the decade or so that I've been in financial services, that's certainly been the approach that I've followed. And I'd say to any young person, and a young woman in particular, entering the commerce field is be very clear about and determined about what you want to achieve, but be open to learning because the times are shifting, and be open to learning from your peers, but also from mentors and sponsors as well.
Khanya, unfortunately, we have come to our time. Thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus. But you're not going to be the last of the representative of Absa, because, of course, your colleague is up next, Pragashini Reddy. Pragashini, she is the executive for digital at Absa Group for Relationship Banking. So do stay tuned. We'll be back after this break.